How could it happen? How could a land for 1,000 years considered the backwater of civilization, the source of gold, incense, exotic beasts and slaves, dare to cast its shadow over the mightiest empire the world had ever known? Why do the royal tombs of these southern kings deep in the heart of Nubia contain artifacts and rituals that perfectly mirror those of Egypt's founding pharaohs, skipping 2 millennia of history as if they never happened? The answer lies buried under the sands of the Sudan, in a story of faith, ambition, and an empire that had forgotten its own soul. For centuries, Egypt had looked south to Nubia, the land they called Kush, with the casual arrogance of a master. They built fortresses, extracted tribute, and imposed their gods and culture upon the Kushite people. But empires, like men, grow old. They grow decadent. By the 8th century before the Common Era, the land of the pharaohs was a fractured mosaic of squabbling city-states and petty kings. The sacred bond between the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, was broken. The temples fell into disrepair, the rites were neglected, and the divine order, Ma'at, was a forgotten memory. Priests vied with generals for power, and Libyan mercenaries carved out their own domains in the Nile Delta. Egypt was a giant with feet of clay, rich and rotten, ripe for the taking. But this is not a simple story of a barbarian horde overrunning a decadent civilization. It is far stranger, far more profound. What compels a people, considered inferior for centuries, to take upon themselves the sacred mission of saving the very culture of their oppressors? In the south, where the Nile's cataracts churned and the desert sun beat down with unforgiving fury, a different power was stirring. In the city of Napata, nestled at the foot of the holy mountain Jebel Barkal, a dynasty of Nubian kings had been quietly watching the chaos in the north. They were not barbarians. They were, in fact, more Egyptian than the Egyptians themselves. For centuries, while Egypt had been cosmopolitan, invaded, and diluted by foreign influences, the Kushites had held fast to the old ways. Their chief god was Amun, the same state deity worshipped in Thebes. Their kings wrote in Egyptian hieroglyphs, built pyramids, albeit smaller, steeper ones, and saw themselves as the true guardians of a faith that the northerners had forsaken. They were not invaders seeking plunder, they were crusaders. They saw the decay in Egypt not as an opportunity for conquest, but as a sacrilege, a cosmic imbalance that they, the pure and devout, were divinely ordained to correct. The Egyptian priests prayed for a savior to restore the glory of the past, but they did not account for the gods sometimes sending saviors with dark skin and steel in their eyes. The preparations for war were meticulous, cloaked in religious fervor. Napatan spies moved through the fractured courts of the north, mapping their weaknesses. Kushite commandos, skilled archers born to the bow, launched lightning raids across the southern border, testing defenses, sowing fear. They were ghosts from the desert, striking and vanishing, their arrows felling sentries on the walls of forts that had stood for 1,000 years. At Jebel Barkal, a mountain the Egyptians themselves believed to be the southern home of the god Amun, an army of unprecedented scale was gathering. They came from the plains of the Butana, from the river towns of Kerma and Kawa. They were warriors hardened by a life of struggle, their bodies lean, their discipline absolute. They did not fight for a warlord or for a share of spoils. They fought for a king who was also their high priest, a man who spoke with the authority of Amun himself. His name was Kashta, and his ambition was simple: to claim the title of pharaoh and reunite the two lands under the rule of its true southern-born god. His son Paye would inherit that ambition and turn it into a firestorm. The contrast was stark. In the northern cities of Tanis and Say, the Libyan dynasts plotted against one another, their courts filled with eunuchs and sycophants, their armies a patchwork of unreliable mercenaries. They saw the stirrings in the south as a provincial nuisance, a border dispute to be handled by a subordinate. They were utterly blind to the ideological hurricane gathering on their doorstep. They did not understand that this was not a war for territory. It was a war for the soul of Egypt. The Nubians were not coming to tear Egypt down. They were coming to rebuild it in their own fiercely traditional image. They were coming to save Egypt from itself. And the price of that salvation would be total submission. An ancient kingdom was about to be reborn in the crucible of a holy war led by men from the land it had once called a mere colony. History is rarely a straight line. Sometimes it is a circle. The power that had flowed north along the Nile for millennia was about to reverse its course in a devastating flood of black warriors and righteous fury. The storm gathered slowly, then all at once. For years, the rulers of Upper Egypt, the southern half of the nation, had paid tribute to the Kushite kings in Napata, a tacit admission of where true power now lay. But one northern warlord, Tefnakht of Sais, a man of boundless ambition and cunning, decided to test the limits of this new reality. He forged a coalition of Delta princelings and began a campaign of his own, marching south, absorbing city after city, his goal to unite Egypt under his own northern banner. He was a pragmatist, a modern man in a world of fading gods. He saw the Nubians as superstitious zealots, a relic of a bygone era. He could not have been more wrong. When news of Tefnakht's aggression reached Piye in Napata, it was not met with political calculation, but with divine outrage. This was not a border incursion, it was heresy. A blasphemer was desecrating the sacred land. Piye's response was recorded for all time, not in a dry court chronicle, but on a massive granite slab known today as the Victory Stele. It is a masterpiece of propaganda, a military report written as an epic poem, a testament to a king who believed he was the chosen instrument of God. He gathered his army not with a call to arms, but with a summons to purification. He commanded his soldiers to cleanse themselves in the Nile, to dress in their finest linen, to anoint themselves, and to abstain from battle until they had prostrated themselves before Amun of Jebel Barkal. "I shall not act without him," Piye declared. "It is he who commands me." His campaign was framed not as a conquest, but as a festival, a holy pilgrimage to cleanse the temples of the north. This was the genius of Piye. He weaponized faith. His warriors were not merely soldiers, they were avenging angels. What do you believe drove this man more? Was it his unshakable faith in his divine mission, or was it a cold, calculated ambition hidden behind the mask of a holy warrior? Share your thoughts in the comments and let's unravel this ancient mystery together. The march began. It was less an invasion and more a relentless, unstoppable tide flowing north along the lifeblood of the Nile. The Kushite army was a marvel of organization and discipline, a perfect fusion of traditional Egyptian structure and Nubian martial prowess. At its core were the archers, the legendary Tasseti, the people of the bow. For centuries, Nubian archers had been the elite mercenaries in Egypt's armies. Now they fought for their own king, their arrows falling in lethal, silent showers that broke enemy formations before the infantry had even clashed. But Piye was more than just a general, he was a master of psychological warfare. As he approached a city, he would offer a simple choice: surrender and live, or resist and be utterly destroyed. "The gates of life are open to you," his heralds would proclaim. "Choose death and do not blame me." To those who submitted, he was magnanimous, often allowing local rulers to keep their posts as his vassals. He would enter their temples, make sacrifices to their gods, and present himself as a restorer, not a conqueror. But for those who defied him, his wrath was terrible. He was fighting a war on two fronts, one of military strategy and one for the narrative of his divine mandate. Every victory was proof of Amun's favor. Every act of mercy was proof of his worthiness to be pharaoh. His strategy was to dismantle Tefnakht's coalition piece by piece, isolating his rivals and turning their allies against them. The great city of Hermopolis under its king Nemlot dared to resist. Nemlot had once sworn allegiance to Piye, but had defected to Tefnakht's side. To Piye, this was not just a political betrayal, it was a personal affront, a stain on his honor. The siege of Hermopolis was a masterclass in ancient warfare. PA's engineers erected a great rampart around the city, topped with wooden towers from which his archers could rain death upon the defenders. Siege engines battered the walls. The Nile itself was his ally, his fleet blockading the city from the river, cutting off all hope of reinforcement or escape. The description on the stele is vivid, brutal, and personal. PA was enraged. He likened the defenders to mice trapped in a granary. After days of relentless assault, Nemlot knew he was beaten. He sent his wife to plead for mercy with the women of PA's court. Finally, he surrendered himself, bringing lavish tribute, including his finest horse, a creature so magnificent that it seemed to capture the Nubian king's attention more than the city's treasures. PA's reaction was telling. He was more furious about the state of Nemlot's starved horses in the city stables than about the human cost of the siege. "I swear," Pia raged, "it is more grievous to my heart that my horses have been starved than any other evil that you have done." This seemingly odd obsession with the welfare of horses was a cultural hallmark of the Kushites, who revered the animals as symbols of status and power. A true king does not just demand obedience, he makes surrender feel like a divine mercy. After Hermopolis, city after city threw open its gates. The coalition of the north crumbled. Finally, only one prize remained: Memphis, the ancient capital, the White Walls, a fortress of immense strategic and symbolic importance. It was here that Tefnakht made his last desperate stand. Memphis was a formidable challenge. Its walls were high, its granaries full, and its garrison numbered 8,000 of Tefnakht's best soldiers. The northern warlord gave them a fiery speech, urging them to hold the city at all costs while he rode north to gather reinforcements. Pia arrived to find the city locked down, seemingly impregnable. His own generals were hesitant, advising a long siege or the construction of elaborate causeways to breach the walls. Pia, a man of decisive and often brutal action, dismissed their caution. He saw a weakness. The city's harbor was crowded with ships, moored tight against the city walls. He devised a daring plan. Under the cover of darkness, his soldiers stormed the harbor, capturing the entire fleet. Then, using the captured ships as scaling ladders, they swarmed over the walls from the riverside, a direction the defenders had considered secure. The city fell in a bloody torrent of violence. Memphis was taken as by a flood of water, the stele boasts. Thousands were slain. The city was plundered, though P, ever mindful of his religious mission, immediately went to the temple of Ptah to make offerings and purify the sacred precinct. The fall of Memphis broke the back of the resistance. Tefnakht, now a fugitive, sent a desperate message of submission. Pa had done it. He had conquered Egypt. He had brought the rebellious north to its knees. In a grand ceremony, the remaining kings and princes of the Delta came to pay him homage, though they were considered so ritually impure from eating fish, a northern delicacy anathema to the Kushites, that they were not allowed to enter his presence. They prostrated themselves on their bellies outside the palace. Pa had fulfilled his destiny. He was now, indisputably, lord of the two lands. But then he did something extraordinary. He did not stay. He loaded his ships with the spoils of his victory and sailed south back to his Nubian capital of Napata, never to set foot in Lower Egypt again. He had cleansed the temples and restored order. For him, the mission was complete. He was the conqueror who came home, leaving his heirs to the messy business of actually ruling the empire he had won. The crown was his, but the throne remained in Thebes, waiting for a new master. Pa's stunning victory and subsequent return to Nubia left a power vacuum in Egypt. He had shattered the northern coalition and asserted his authority, but he had not established a permanent administration. He ruled from afar, a distant, almost mythical overlord in his southern capital. It was his brother and successor, Shabaka, who would take the next decisive step. Shabaka understood that an empire could not be governed from a distance. He marched north, not as a conqueror this time, but as a king coming to claim his throne. The remaining embers of resistance were quickly extinguished. One of Tefnacht's successors, a warlord named Bakenranef, was captured and, according to later, perhaps embellished, accounts, burned alive, a brutal message to any who would challenge Kushite rule. Shabaka established his capital not in the north, but in the ancient religious heart of Egypt, Thebes. It was a brilliant political move. By ruling from the city of the god Amun, he cemented his legitimacy, presenting himself not as a foreign ruler, but as the rightful heir to the great pharaohs of the new kingdom like Thutmose III and Ramesses the Great. The 25th dynasty had officially begun. The age of the Black Pharaohs was here. Their rule was a paradox. They were outsiders who championed native tradition with a zeal the Egyptians themselves had lost. Their mission was to turn back the clock, to erase the centuries of division and foreign influence and resurrect the glory of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. This was not a time of grand military campaigns, but of a cultural and religious revolution. Shabaka and his successors initiated a massive program of construction and restoration across the entire Nile Valley. They did not impose Nubian culture. Instead, they sponsored a renaissance of purely Egyptian art and architecture. Statues carved during their reign consciously mimicked the style of works created 1,000, even 2,000 years earlier. The features of the Kushite kings, their broad noses, full lips, and distinctively round faces, were carved in the severe, idealized forms of Egypt's Golden Age. It was an archaizing period, a deliberate effort to connect with a powerful, pure past. Inscriptions were written in archaic forms of the language, and religious texts from centuries before were painstakingly copied and preserved. One of the most famous examples is the Shabaka stone, a slab of granite on which the pharaoh ordered the preservation of an ancient Memphite theological text which, he claimed, had been found being eaten by worms. To wear the crown of your former master is the easy part. The hard part is convincing his ghost you are worthy of it. The Kushites were positioning themselves as the saviors of Egyptian civilization, the restorers of Ma'at, the divine order. They were the ultimate conservatives, traditionalists in a world that had forgotten its traditions. But this cultural project was underpinned by an iron fist. The local Egyptian elites, particularly in the north, had not simply forgotten their ambitions. They watched, they waited, and they plotted. The Kushite pharaohs ruled a land that was outwardly pacified but inwardly seething with resentment. The administration of the empire was a delicate balancing act. The pharaohs placed trusted Nubian commanders in key military garrisons, but often left local civil administration in the hands of Egyptian nobles. This created a constant, simmering tension. Conspiracies were a persistent threat, and the Kushite response was swift and merciless. Yet, for several decades, this strange arrangement held. Egypt was once again unified. Its wealth flowed into the treasuries of Thebes and Napata. Grand new colonnades were added to the colossal temple of Karnak. Monuments bearing the names of Kushite kings rose alongside those of Egypt's most legendary rulers. They controlled an empire that stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean deep into modern-day Sudan, a territory larger than Egypt had controlled for centuries. They had achieved the impossible. The former colony now ruled the metropole. The vile Kushites, as earlier pharaonic texts had called them, were now the defenders of the faith, the arbiters of culture, the lords of the two lands. They had looked into the decaying heart of a great civilization and, instead of plundering its corpse, had decided to breathe new life into it. They had imposed order, restored the gods, and rebuilt the temples. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as if the Golden Age had returned. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They had been so focused on looking inward, on healing the soul of Egypt, that they had failed to notice the new monster rising on the eastern horizon. The peace they had so carefully constructed was about to be shattered by an empire that had no interest in restoration, only in total, brutal domination. A new power was coming, forged in the fires of Mesopotamia, and its name was Assyria. The world was changing. In the iron-rich hills of northern Mesopotamia, a new kind of empire had been forged. The Assyrians were not like the Egyptians or the Kushites. They did not conquer to restore a divine order or to spread a culture. They conquered for the sake of conquest itself. Theirs was a state built on and for perpetual warfare. Their army was the most terrifying military machine the world had yet seen. It was a professional standing army armed with superior iron weapons against the bronze of their enemies. They had perfected siege warfare with massive iron-tipped battering rams, mobile siege towers, and corps of engineers who could undermine the strongest walls. But their most effective weapon was terror. The Assyrians practiced a calculated policy of frightfulness. They would flay rebellious kings alive, create pyramids of severed heads, and deport entire populations, replacing them with strangers to break any sense of local identity. Their kings boasted of their cruelty in their royal annals, using fear as an instrument of state policy. By the late 8th century before the Common Era, the Assyrian juggernaut had rolled relentlessly westward, crushing kingdom after kingdom in Syria and the Levant. The small states in their path faced a simple choice: become a vassal and pay crippling tribute, or be annihilated. It was in this cauldron of fear and violence that Egypt, under its new Kushite masters, was inevitably drawn. The pharaohs saw themselves as the protectors of the established world order and began to support the local Levantine kings in their resistance against Assyria. They sent aid, encouraged rebellion, and formed coalitions. To the Assyrian king Sennacherib, this was an intolerable interference. He saw the Kushite pharaoh as a meddler, a reed that splinters and pierces the hand of anyone who leans on it. The collision was inevitable. The two great superpowers of the age were on a crash course. The flashpoint came in the year 701 before the Common Era, in the Philistine plain at the city of El-Tekeh. Sennacherib had marched south to crush a rebellion led by Hezekiah of Judah, a rebellion that had been actively encouraged by Egypt. The Kushite pharaoh, Shabaka's successor Shebitku, dispatched an army to support his allies. The force was commanded by his nephew and heir, the young prince Taharka. It was the first major confrontation between the disciplined, iron-clad legions of Assyria and the Kushite-led armies of Egypt. The details of the battle are sparse, filtered through the boastful inscriptions of Sennacherib. But the outcome is clear. It was a crushing defeat for the Egyptian coalition. The Assyrian king claimed to have personally defeated the princes of Egypt and the archers, chariots, and cavalry of the king of Ethiopia, using the common term for Nubia. He described capturing Egyptian nobles and charioteers alive. Taharka, who was likely only in his early 20s, was forced to retreat with the battered remnants of his army. It was a brutal awakening. The Kushites and Egyptians may have been masters of traditional warfare, but they had come up against something new, something terrifyingly efficient and ruthless. Faith can move mountains, but it is a poor shield against 1,000 tons of Assyrian iron. For Assyria, it was a confirmation of their military supremacy. For Egypt, it was a catastrophe, a humiliation that exposed their vulnerability. The aura of pharaonic power, which had protected Egypt for millennia, had been shattered on the battlefield of El-Tekeh. Sennacherib did not press his advantage and invade Egypt itself. He was distracted by a rebellion closer to home, in Babylon, and turned back. But the die was cast. The long, bloody war for control of the Near East had begun. Egypt was no longer an isolated, self-contained civilization protected by its deserts. It was now a player in a brutal game of international power politics, and its primary opponent was an empire whose capacity for violence was seemingly limitless. The defeat at El-Tekeh ushered in a new era of fear and uncertainty. The Kushite pharaohs now had to look over their shoulders, constantly wary of the Assyrian threat on their northeastern border. They continued their policy of fomenting rebellion among the Assyrian vassals in the Levant, playing a dangerous game of proxy warfare. It was a strategy of containment, a desperate attempt to keep the Assyrian war machine bogged down far from the banks of the Nile. For a few decades, a tense stalemate held. The Assyrians were occupied with their own internal problems, and the Kushites focused on strengthening their hold on Egypt. But everyone knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The first encounter had been a bloody lesson. The next would be a war for survival. The Assyrians now saw Egypt not just as a rival, but as a prize to be taken, the final jewel in the crown of their world empire. The question was no longer if they would come, but when. The fate of the 25th Dynasty and of Egypt itself now rested on their ability to withstand the coming storm. Facing this new, terrifying enemy, was it wiser for the pharaohs to confront the Assyrians in a decisive, open battle, or should they have adopted a strategy of attrition and guerrilla tactics, using the desert as their shield? Tell us what you would have done in the comments below. In the year 690, before the Common Era, the throne of Egypt passed to the man who had commanded the army at El Teke, Taharka. His reign would mark both the zenith and the beginning of the end for the 25th dynasty. He was perhaps the greatest of the Black Pharaohs, a man of immense energy, piety, and military skill. He inherited an empire that was outwardly prosperous and secure, but living on borrowed time. For the first decade of his rule, a fragile peace held. The new Assyrian king, Esarhaddon, was busy consolidating his own power and putting down revolts elsewhere. Taharka seized this opportunity. He embarked on an ambitious building program that rivaled those of the great pharaohs of the new kingdom. His monuments rose across the entire length of his vast realm, from the delta in the north to Meroe, deep in the south. In the great temple complex at Karnak, he erected a colossal colonnade in the main courtyard, its single remaining column still standing today as a testament to his grand vision. He built new temples in his Nubian homeland and extensively restored existing ones in Egypt. He presented himself as the quintessential pharaoh, a mighty builder, a devout priest, and a protector of his people. He even managed to win a series of victories against rebellious Libyan tribes in the western desert. The inscriptions from this period speak of prosperity, of bountiful harvests, and of a land at peace. It was the last golden summer of the Kushite Empire. Some men are born to build empires, others are born to die trying to hold one together. But the storm on the horizon had not dissipated. Esarhaddon had not forgotten Egypt. He saw Taharka's support for anti-Assyrian coalitions in the Levant as a persistent threat that had to be eliminated. In 674, he launched his first invasion attempt. It was a disaster. The Assyrian army was defeated by Taharka's forces somewhere in the Sinai Desert, a major victory for Egypt that is conveniently omitted from the Assyrian records but alluded to in Babylonian chronicles. Taharka's prestige soared. He had done what no other king had managed to do. He had stopped the Assyrian juggernaut in its tracks, but he had only wounded the beast, not killed it. 3 years later, in 671, Esarhaddon returned. This time, he was not to be denied. He had learned from his mistakes. His army marched with grim determination, not directly across the punishing Sinai, but on a more southerly route. He brought not just soldiers, but camels carrying water, creating a mobile supply line through the arid wasteland. The two armies met again on the frontier. This time, the result was different. After a series of brutal battles over 15 days, Taharka's army was broken. The Assyrians advanced into the Nile Delta, a region filled with local dynasts who were only too willing to switch their allegiance from their Kushite masters to a new, more powerful overlord. Esarhaddon moved on the capital, Memphis. The city that Pi had taken in a brilliant amphibious assault was now subjected to a ferocious Assyrian siege. The Assyrians stormed the walls and the city fell. The sack of Memphis was a horror. Esarhaddon's annals describe it with chilling glee. I conquered the city and leveled it. I destroyed it by fire. I burned it. He captured Taharka's wife, his harem, and his son, along with immense treasures. The Assyrian king had struck a devastating blow at the heart of the empire. Taharka himself was wounded in the fighting, but he managed to escape the slaughter. Beaten but not broken, he fled south to the ancient capital of Thebes, the religious heartland of his dynasty's power. Esarhaddon now controlled all of Lower Egypt. He installed a collection of local Egyptian princes as his puppet rulers, binding them with oaths of loyalty. To commemorate his victory, he had a stele carved showing his own towering figure holding two tiny, kneeling captives on leashes. One was a king from the Levant, the other was explicitly identified as Ushankuru, the son of Taharka, a Kushite prince with distinctly African features. The message was clear and brutal. The age of the Black Pharaohs was over, but Esarhaddon had underestimated his opponent. No sooner had the main Assyrian army withdrawn, leaving only garrisons behind, than Taharka began to plot his return. From his refuge in Thebes, he rallied his forces. The Egyptian people, groaning under the harsh rule of the Assyrians and their puppets, longed for his return. In a stunning display of resilience, Taharka marched north again, retaking Memphis and slaughtering the Assyrian garrisons. He was once again the master of a reunified Egypt. It was a heroic, defiant comeback, the act of a king who refused to accept defeat. But it was also a fatal provocation. When news of Taharka's reconquest reached the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, the response was one of cold, murderous fury. Esarhaddon immediately began preparing a new, even larger army to march on Egypt and finish the job once and for all. He would die on the way, but his son and successor, the ruthless and brilliant Ashurbanipal, would inherit his father's army and his obsession with destroying the defiant king of Kush. Taharka had held the sky aloft, but now the heavens were about to fall. Taharka, the great survivor, the Atlas of the Nile, would not live to see the final cataclysmic chapter of the war he had fought for so long. He died in 664 before the Common Era and was buried in his pyramid at Nuri, the largest ever built for a Kushite king. His designated heir, Tantamani, his nephew, inherited a throne that was also a death sentence. He was a man of courage and piety, but he was stepping onto a stage where the final act of a tragedy was already in motion. Emboldened by a dream in which he was promised dominion over both the south and the north, Tantamani repeated the feat of his ancestor, Piye. He sailed down the Nile from Nubia, gathering support as he went. He retook Memphis with relative ease, killing the Assyrian-appointed puppet king Necho I. For a fleeting moment it must have seemed like the glory days had returned. The Kushites were once again masters of all Egypt. But this was merely the calm before the apocalypse. In Nineveh, Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, received the news of Tantamani's rebellion not as a setback, but as the final justification he needed for a war of annihilation. He was not interested in vassals or tribute anymore. He wanted to excise the Kushite cancer, as he saw it, from the body of his empire forever. He assembled a colossal army, the full might of the Assyrian Empire, and unleashed it upon Egypt. The Assyrians swept into the delta with unstoppable force. Tantamani's smaller army met them near the city of Tanis and was utterly annihilated. The Kushite king fled, racing south along the river with the Assyrian legions in hot pursuit. He took refuge in Thebes, the sacred capital, the city of 100 gates, the religious center of the known world for over 1,000 years. It was a city that had been sacked before in its long history, but never like this. Ashurbanipal's army arrived before its walls, not just as conquerors, but as executioners. The siege was short. The outcome was never in doubt. The Assyrians breached the defenses and poured into the city, and what followed was a horror that sent shockwaves across the ancient world. It was not just a sacking, it was a calculated, systematic obliteration of a civilization's sacred heart. The Assyrian soldiers, writes Ashurbanipal in his annals with sickening pride, fell upon it like a storm. They took the entire city. Silver, gold, precious stones, the treasures of the palace, rich-colored clothing, linen, great horses, the people, male and female, I carried off as booty to Assyria. I left not one. They stripped the great temples, including the vast complex of Karnak. They took the two massive electrum-plated obelisks that stood before the Temple of Amun, a feat of engineering in itself, and hauled them away. They burned homes, smashed statues, and slaughtered anyone who stood in their way. A city is not just stone and gold, it is a belief. And when that belief is shattered, the walls offer no protection. The prophet Nahum in the Hebrew Bible, writing years later, used the fall of Thebes as the ultimate example of divine retribution, a symbol of a great city brought to utter ruin. The psychological impact was immense. Thebes was not just any city, it was the home of Amun-Ra, king of the gods. Its violation was a profound sacrilege, a demonstration that nothing was sacred to the Assyrians, that their power superseded that of the gods themselves. Tantamani, seeing that all was lost, abandoned the city to its fate. He fled further south, beyond the first cataract of the Nile, back into the Nubian heartland from which his ancestors had come. He had lost Egypt. He had lost its holiest city. The great project of the 25th Dynasty, the restoration of pharaonic civilization, had come to a crashing, bloody end in the smoking ruins of Thebes. Ashurbanipal placed a new puppet on the throne of Egypt, Psamtik I, the son of the Necho who Tantamani had killed. This new dynasty, the 26th, or Sate dynasty, would rule under the shadow of Assyrian power. The Kushites were gone from Egypt, driven out not just as a defeated army, but as a reviled enemy. The great dream was over. The Black Pharaohs, who had seen themselves as the saviors of Egypt, had been cast out, their reign ending in the greatest catastrophe the land of the Nile had seen in a millennium. They had flown too close to the sun, and the Assyrian hammer had melted their wings. The age of their empire was over, but their story was not. They had been defeated, but they had not been destroyed. The survivors of the cataclysm now faced a long, hard journey home, back to the lands from which they had emerged, to forge a new future from the ashes of their shattered dream. The road back to Nubia was not just a retreat, it was a return to their origins, a long march into a future where they would have to redefine what it meant to be the heirs of the pharaohs, far from the sacred soil of Egypt itself. The fall of Thebes was the end of an epoch. For the Kushite rulers, there was no longer any hope of holding Egypt. Tantamani and the tattered remnants of his court, his administration, and his army began the long, arduous retreat south. This was not a panicked flight, but a strategic withdrawal. They were abandoning the conquered lands to preserve the core of their kingdom, their culture, and their identity. The journey was fraught with peril. Assyrian detachments, along with the forces of their new Egyptian vassals, harried their rearguard. They had to navigate the treacherous cataracts of the Nile, fight off hostile desert tribes, and move an entire ruling class, priests, scribes, artisans, and nobles, hundreds of miles back to their ancestral homeland. It was an exodus, a tragic reversal of the triumphant march north that Pi had undertaken less than a century before. They brought with them what they could salvage: sacred texts, religious customs, and the unshakable belief that they were the true heirs of pharaonic tradition. You only truly lose a kingdom when you forget how to rule yourselves, even without a throne. Back in Napata, the old Kushite capital at the foot of Jebel Barkal, the dynasty regrouped. They still controlled a vast and wealthy territory, the lands of Nubia, rich in gold, cattle, and trade routes to the heart of Africa. They had lost Egypt, but they had not lost their kingdom. In a strange quirk of history, the Kushite kings in Napata continued to call themselves pharaohs, lords of the two lands. They continued to use Egyptian hieroglyphs, worship Egyptian gods, and build pyramids for their tombs. They ruled a kind of ghost Egypt, a kingdom in exile preserving the pharaonic culture with a purity that was ironically now being lost in Egypt itself. Under the new Sate dynasty, Egypt began to turn its face towards the Mediterranean, opening up to Greek traders and mercenaries, its culture slowly Hellenizing. The Kushites in Nubia, however, became a time capsule, a civilization that clung fiercely to the past. This retreat marked a fundamental shift. The center of their world was no longer Thebes, it was Napata. Their focus was no longer on ruling a vast bicultural empire, but on consolidating and defending their own Nubian heartland. The dream of reuniting the two lands was dead, but the Kushite kingdom itself was very much alive. It had been forged in the crucible of war and defeat, and it had emerged tougher, more isolated, but also more uniquely itself. The kings who followed Tantameni turned their attention south, expanding their influence deeper into Africa. They were no longer players on the world stage of the Near East, but they were the dominant power in their own region. They had looked into the abyss of total annihilation at the hands of the Assyrians and had survived. They had lost an empire but saved their soul. Now they had to build a new civilization, one that honored its Egyptian past but was rooted firmly in its African soil. The trauma of the Assyrian invasion would scar them forever, but it would also temper them, preparing them for the next great empire that would come marching down the Nile. Generations would pass, new cities would rise, and new threats would emerge. The world would forget about the black-skinned pharaohs who had once ruled Egypt. But the kingdom of Kush endured, a silent testament to a legacy that refused to die. The retreat was a bitter pill, a symbol of a shattered dream. But was it an act of shameful cowardice, or was it a display of ultimate pragmatism, sacrificing territory to save their people and culture? Let us know what you think in the comments. A leader's hardest choices are often the most important. For centuries, the Kushite kingdom thrived in its splendid isolation. The world outside changed dramatically. The Assyrian Empire crumbled, replaced by the Babylonians, who were in turn conquered by the Persians. Then came Alexander the Great, and after his death, his general Ptolemy seized Egypt, establishing a Greek-speaking dynasty. All the while, the kingdom of Kush looked on from the south, a silent observer of the rise and fall of giants. During this time, the center of the kingdom shifted even further south, from Napata to the city of Meroe. This move was likely prompted by a combination of factors, including the sacking of Napata by an Egyptian army in the 6th century before the Common Era, and the fact that the region around Meroe was rich in iron ore and hardwood, crucial resources for a new economy. The Meroitic period marked a profound transformation. While the Kushites continued to revere the old Egyptian gods and bury their rulers in pyramids, they began to forge a new, unique identity. They developed their own writing system, a cursive script known as Meroitic, which is still not fully deciphered to this day. This shift from using Egyptian hieroglyphs to their own language represented a declaration of cultural independence. Their art also evolved, blending pharaonic motifs with distinctly African elements. The slender, idealized figures of Egyptian art were replaced by more robust, rounded figures, celebrating a different ideal of beauty and power. Meroe became a major hub of industry, especially ironworking. Its furnaces glowed day and night, producing weapons and tools that were traded far and wide, making the kingdom wealthy and powerful. One of the most remarkable features of the Meroitic kingdom was the prominent role of women. Power was often wielded by ruling queens who held the title of Candace or Candace. These were not simply queen consorts or regents for young sons. They were absolute monarchs in their own right, leading armies, negotiating treaties, and commissioning vast building projects. This tradition of female leadership was a stark contrast to the male-dominated societies of Greece and Rome. And it was one of these powerful Candaces who would lead her people against the next great superpower to cast its shadow over the Nile, Rome. After the Roman conquest of Egypt in 30, before the Common Era, the legions of the Emperor Augustus began to push south, seeking to secure the empire's new frontier. They saw the kingdom of Meroe as just another barbarian state to be subjugated. They were about to receive a rude shock. In 24 before the Common Era, while the Roman governor of Egypt was away on a campaign in Arabia, the Kushite army, likely led by the formidable Candace Amanirenas, stormed across the border. they launched a surprise attack on the Roman garrisons at Syene, Elephantine, and Philae, overwhelming the defenders and driving the Romans out of southern Egypt. In a gesture of supreme defiance, they captured a bronze head from a statue of the Emperor Augustus, carried it back to Meroe, and buried it beneath the steps of a temple dedicated to their god of victory. Every person entering the temple would thus trample upon the image of the Roman emperor. Empires that believe the world ends at their borders often find their greatest enemies living just beyond them. The Roman response was swift and brutal. A punitive expedition of 10,000 legionaries marched south, razing Napata and enslaving its inhabitants. But Meroe itself, protected by hundreds of miles of harsh desert, remained beyond their reach. The Kushites, masters of their own terrain, engaged in a brilliant campaign of guerrilla warfare. They harassed the Roman supply lines, launched hit-and-run raids, and then melted back into the desert landscapes the Romans could not master. After several years of inconclusive and costly fighting, the Romans realized they could not conquer this fierce desert kingdom. In a remarkable turn of events, the two powers negotiated a peace treaty. The terms were stunningly favorable to Meroe. The Romans withdrew from the border territories they had occupied, and the treaty established a permanent frontier. Even more astonishingly, the Romans cancelled their demand for tribute. The Candace Amanirenas had faced down the most powerful empire in the world and had fought it to a standstill. She had preserved her kingdom's independence. For the next few centuries, Meroe and Rome coexisted, largely peacefully, as trading partners. The kingdom of Kush had proven its resilience once again. It had survived the Assyrians, and now it had survived the Romans. It continued to thrive for hundreds of more years, a unique African civilization with ancient roots, a testament to the enduring legacy of the Black Pharaohs. But while they were winning wars against new enemies, a different kind of war was being waged against their ancestors, a silent, insidious war against memory itself. The legacy of the 25th Dynasty faced two waves of destruction. The first was political, immediate, and brutal. The second was intellectual, lasting for centuries, and rooted in prejudice. As soon as the Kushites were driven from Egypt, the new Egyptian pharaohs of the 26th, or Sate, dynasty began a systematic campaign to erase them from history. This was not unusual in the ancient world. New rulers often sought to delegitimize their predecessors, but the Sate effort was particularly thorough. This process is known as damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. Statues of the Kushite kings were toppled, smashed, or usurped. In the grand temple of Karnak, workers were dispatched with chisels to meticulously chip away the names of kings like Taharka and Shabaka from the royal cartouches carved into the temple walls and columns. Sometimes the name of a Sate pharaoh was carved directly over the erased Kushite name, a blatant act of historical theft. The goal was to create the impression that these dark-skinned rulers from the south had never existed, or, if they had, that they were illegitimate usurpers, a brief, shameful interruption in the true line of Egyptian pharaohs. Killing a king is simple. To truly destroy his legacy, you must convince the world he never truly ruled at all. This official vandalism was incredibly effective. Within a few generations, the memory of the powerful Nubian dynasty that had saved and restored Egypt was fading within Egypt itself. Later, Greek historians like Herodotus would hear only garbled tales of an Ethiopian conquest, confusing names and dates, reducing a complex and powerful century of history to a few vague anecdotes. The second wave of erasure came much later, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, with the birth of modern Egyptology. As European and American archaeologists began to uncover the wonders of ancient Egypt, they did so through the lens of their own era's deeply ingrained racial prejudices. The prevailing view was that black Africans were an inferior race, incapable of creating a high civilization. When evidence of the 25th dynasty began to emerge, inscriptions bearing their names, statues clearly depicting their sub-Saharan African features, it created a profound cognitive dissonance for these early scholars. They simply could not accept the reality of what they were seeing. How could Negroid kings have ruled the great civilization of Egypt? Their solution was to downplay, dismiss, or misinterpret the evidence. They cast the Kushite rulers as a brief, chaotic interlude, a period of foreign domination by primitive barbarians who had briefly squatted on the pharaonic throne before the true Egyptians restored order. The great archaeologist George Reisner, who did more than anyone to excavate the Kushite royal cemeteries, was a product of this mindset. Despite uncovering the magnificent tombs of the Nubian kings filled with exquisite treasures, he could not bring himself to credit the people he was digging up. He theorized that the Kushite elite were not truly Nubian, but were a light-skinned race of Libyan or Egyptian origin who had imposed themselves on the local black population. He saw them as Egyptians with a local tincture. He simply could not conceive of a homegrown black African civilization of such power and sophistication. This academic prejudice effectively wrote the Black Pharaohs out of the popular history of ancient Egypt. Textbooks and museum exhibits focused on the familiar figures of Tutankhamun, Cleopatra, and Ramesses, while the powerful Kushite kings were relegated to a footnote, if they were mentioned at all. Their art was dismissed as derivative, their rule as illegitimate. A whole chapter of world history was effectively censored, not by an ancient king with a chisel, but by modern scholars with a pen, blinded by their own biases. They were engaged in a war for memory, a battle against inconvenient facts that challenged their worldview. The Kushites had built temples, unified an empire, and stood against the might of Assyria, but their greatest battle would be fought thousands of years after their deaths, against the curse of being forgotten. For centuries, the truth lay buried, not just under the desert sands, but under layers of political propaganda and racial prejudice. The story was lost, the kings were ghosts. But the desert does not keep its secrets forever, and the stones themselves were about to cry out, demanding that the story be told. The truth began to re-emerge, piece by piece, from the sands of northern Sudan at the dawn of the 20th century. The key figure in this rediscovery was, ironically, the same Harvard archaeologist who harbored such deep-seated prejudices, George Reisner. Between 1913 and 1932, Reisner led expeditions to excavate the royal cemeteries of the Kushite kingdom at El Kuru and Nuri. What he found there should have immediately shattered every preconceived notion about a primitive South. He unearthed a series of pyramids, the burial places of the kings of the 25th Dynasty and their successors. While plundered in antiquity, the tombs still contained a wealth of artifacts, stunning jewelry, intricate pottery, and a series of magnificent life-sized statues of the Kushite kings, including Taharqa. These statues were masterpieces of sculpture, capturing the power and majesty of their subjects. Their features were unmistakably African. The evidence was irrefutable. Here was the proof of a powerful, wealthy, and highly sophisticated Black African civilization that had not only existed but had conquered Egypt. Reisner meticulously documented and photographed his finds, creating an invaluable archaeological record, but his own interpretation of the data remained clouded by his biases. He had found the body of the crime, but he refused to name the culprit who had been written out of history. His incredible discoveries were published in dense academic volumes, but they did not immediately change the popular narrative. The ghosts of the Black Pharaohs remained in the shadows. The turning point came in the 1960s with a crisis of monumental proportions. The Egyptian government, with international support, was building the Aswan High Dam. This great project would create a massive reservoir, Lake Nasser, which would submerge hundreds of miles of the Nile Valley in southern Egypt and northern Sudan. This was the ancient heartland of Nubia. Hundreds of ancient temples, settlements, and archaeological sites, including many from the Kushite period, were doomed to be lost forever beneath the waters. In response, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, launched an unprecedented international salvage campaign. It was the largest archaeological rescue operation in history. Teams from all over the world flocked to Nubia in a desperate race against the rising waters. They excavated sites, dismantled entire temples block by block to be rebuilt on higher ground, and surveyed and documented everything that could not be saved. This intense focus on Nubia brought the history and culture of the Kushite kingdom to the world's attention as never before. The campaign was a triumph of international cooperation, but more than that, it was a moment of profound revelation. The sheer scale and richness of the Nubian archaeological record, brought to light by the impending flood, made it impossible to ignore any longer. Scholars began to re-examine the evidence, free from the prejudices of the past. Truth, like the Nile, can be dammed for a time, but eventually it will find its way back to the sea. In the decades that followed, a new generation of historians and archaeologists began to piece together the true story of the 25th Dynasty. They reread Paye's victory stele not as the boast of a barbarian, but as a sophisticated document of a devout and brilliant military leader. They looked at the art of the Kushite period and saw not a clumsy imitation, but a powerful and deliberate revival of ancient traditions. They recognized the rule of the Black Pharaohs not as a chaotic interruption, but as a vital and dynamic chapter in Egyptian history, a time when the empire was reunified and its ancient culture was saved from decay by zealous outsiders who revered it more than the natives. Today, the story is finally being told. Museum exhibits around the world now celebrate the art and history of the Kushite kingdom. Documentaries, books, and articles are restoring the Black Pharaohs to their rightful place in the grand narrative of human civilization. It is a story of incredible resilience, not just of the ancient kings themselves, but of their memory, which survived millennia of suppression and neglect. The history of the Black Pharaohs was nearly erased, first by political revenge and later by racial prejudice. It was rescued from oblivion only by the painstaking work of scientists and a global effort to save a shared heritage. This raises a crucial question about how we guard our past. Tell us, what do you believe is a greater threat to the future? The deliberate distortion of history by those in power, or the indifferent forgetfulness of a society that allows prejudice to bury the truth? Share your answer in the comments. This battle for the past is a battle for the present, and it is far from over. The discovery of the Kushite kings is more than just an addition to the long list of Egypt's dynasties. It is a fundamental correction to our understanding of the ancient world. It challenges our assumptions about the relationship between Egypt and the cultures to its south, forcing us to see the Nile not as a one-way street of influence flowing from north to south, but as a dynamic artery of exchange, conflict, and cultural fusion. The story of these kings reveals that the history of Africa is not peripheral to the story of civilization. It is central to it. They were not an anomaly. They were the product of a powerful, long-standing African civilization that interacted with Egypt for thousands of years as a rival, a partner, a colony, and ultimately a conqueror. Their legacy is a powerful reminder that history is often more complex and surprising than the simplified versions we are taught. It shows us that greatness can arise from unexpected places, that those dismissed as barbarians can become the staunchest defenders of tradition, and that the lines we draw on maps and in our minds to separate races and cultures are often meaningless in the grand sweep of time. The battle for their legacy continues. As new archaeological work is done in Sudan, our knowledge of the Kushite kingdom grows richer and more detailed every year. The Meroitic script, the last great linguistic puzzle of the ancient Nile Valley, still holds its secrets, but scholars are getting closer to deciphering it. When they do, the stones will speak again, and the Kushites will be able to tell their own story in their own words for the first time in 2,000 years. The story of the Black Pharaohs is a testament to the enduring power of ideas, the cyclical nature of empires, and the long, slow, but ultimately triumphant march of historical truth. It teaches us that no legacy is ever truly lost, as long as there are those willing to search for it. The kings who were buried twice, once in their pyramids and a second time by the prejudice of history, have finally returned.